Well, hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning into this Approaching the Scene. I'm Hudson Henry, and today I have something that I'm really proud to share with you all, something I'm kind of excited about. It's my core Fundamentals of Exposure training video. It explains all the different variables and how you can use them creatively and what their side effects are in exposure. And it's I've done several iterations of this in the past as part of different training courses. But this last summer, I went out with my good friend, the filmmaker Andy Adkins from Floating Point Films, and we filmed this big 30-episode core Fundamentals of Photography course traveling through the desert Southwest, and cut this exposure triangle video out in the middle of the Great Salt Lake. So when it's over, I'll come back in, I'll take a few questions and do kind of more of the normal Approaching the Scene thing. But for now, just enjoy the video. I think you're really going to like it. Let's talk about exposure and the variables that we use to control exposure. There are 3 exposure variables, and they're commonly referenced as a triangle, which I think makes a lot of sense. If you change one or another of these variables, you need to keep all 3 in balance so that you have a proper exposure value. The first variable that I want to talk about, the first point on the exposure triangle, is aperture. And I think it's one that throws people for a loop. And it's really not as complicated as it seems. We're just going to hit it head on. The primary effect of aperture on exposure is to control the intensity of the light moving through your lens to the sensor. It does that through a mechanism that's a lot like the iris in the human eye. It's an aperture. Aperture is really just a fancy word for hole. There's a mechanism in your lens like the iris in the human eye that it contracts and expands to make that aperture smaller or wider. Think about when you're in a sunlit scene like this, your human eye, that iris expands to make a tiny aperture, a small pupil, and it lets less intense light come in to expose so that you can see the scene around you. If you walk into a darkened room, the opposite thing happens. That iris contracts, the aperture expands, the aperture is your pupil. Same thing's happening with the camera. There's what's known as a diaphragm, an aperture diaphragm, contracting and expanding to make a larger or smaller aperture to control that intensity of the light moving through the scene. We express aperture as f numbers or f-stops. They're super confusing. They don't make a whole lot of sense, and they don't really need to. There is a mathematical reference for them. They're numbers like 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, etc. No rhyme or reason, really. There is an explanation. You can look it up if you want, but all you really need to know is that the smaller that number, the wider open that aperture is, the more intense light coming through to your sensor. If you have a larger aperture number, that aperture is shrunken down to a smaller point, like a narrowed pupil, and it's less intense light moving through to your sensor. There's one side effect that you need to keep in mind with aperture, and that's depth of field. Depth of field essentially refers to how much of your scene appears to be in focus. And by changing the aperture, you do manipulate depth of field so that you can make more of the scene appear in focus or less of the scene appear in focus. It's kind of both a side effect and a great creative tool. So that's all you need to keep in mind about aperture. The second variable, or point on the exposure triangle that we're going to talk about, is shutter speed. Shutter speed's primary effect on exposure is to control the amount of time that the sensor is capturing the light moving through the lens's aperture diaphragm. The primary mechanism by which it does that is the shutter. The shutter is simply like a gate. It opens and closes to allow light to flow between the lens and the sensor. When we have more time being captured, we have more exposure, more light being captured, you get a brighter image. With a faster shutter speed, less time being captured, darker image. We express shutter speed in fractions of seconds generally, sometimes in seconds for really long exposures, but most of the time it's a fraction of a second. It's very quick. And we usually abbreviate those fractions. So 1/500th of a second, we'll usually just say, I shot it at 500. 500, 1,000, 2,000, that's 2,000th of a second. The side effects of shutter speed are motion blur. So if you have too slow a shutter speed, too long a shutter speed, sometimes just hand holding can induce shake and you wind up with a blurry image. If subjects are moving by and you have too slow a shutter speed, the subjects can appear to blur. So you need to keep that in mind with shutter speed. So the third and final exposure variable, the final point on the exposure triangle that we're going to talk about, is ISO. And ISO is simply an amplification of the light being captured by your camera's sensor. We express ISO in ISO numbers. They're actually a reference to film sensitivity numbers from the days of film. And the reason for it is that as we made the transition from film to digital, the digital camera makers wanted to have a bridge so that film photographers didn't feel confused by the new settings numbers. So don't worry about why they're 100, 200, 400, 800. That's just simply a reference to the days of film. Just understand that the smaller the ISO number, the less that light reaching the sensor is being amplified. There are a couple of side effects to keep in mind with ISO. The higher you amplify the signal, the higher the ISO number, the more noise you're going to get in your image. And I like to think about an older stereo system. You turn up a dim old recording on a stereo's amplifier, and there's noise in that old recording. And as you try to amplify a dim old recording, you're going to hear more hissing and more noise. It's really the same with a dim image when you're working in low light and you amplify that light being captured by the sensor. You're just going to get more noise. A second side effect that less people think about is a reduction in the amount of shadow detail and highlight detail that your camera is able to capture at the same time. That's usually referred to as dynamic range, that ability to capture bright, bright highlights and dark, dark shadows at the same time. And just know the human eye is capable of seeing far more detail in the highlights and shadows at the same time as any camera sensor at this point. But as you amplify those ISO settings, as you go to higher ISO numbers, you're going to reduce that dynamic range that your camera is capable of capturing. So those are just things to keep in mind with ISO. So to summarize, the points of the exposure triangle, the variables that they represent are aperture, which simply controls the intensity of the light flowing through the sensor, shutter speed, which controls the amount of time that that sensor is capturing the light flowing through the aperture, and then ISO, which amplifies that light signal that's being captured by the sensor. Okay, so mad props to Andy for some of that post-production work with that video. I mean, the two of us kind of hatched the plan, thought about the place, and it was a really fun, if kind of hot session filming that thing. Now, it's part of a much larger course that I'm offering, and it's in my store. The link is down below here on the YouTube page to my Approaching the Scene core photography course. I know, a lot of you may not be a part of the On1 community. And On1, I've done a lot of training courses, particularly for their Plus photography community. The Plus photography community has seen this and has access to this course. But for those of you that aren't in that community, I'm offering it both for On1's Photo Raw software as well as for Lightroom, Lightroom Classic CC. So go ahead, check that out. It's part of a much bigger course that's broken into 4 parts. It's broken into the scene, which is where we talk about what to do to think about a scene from a compositional standpoint, from a scouting standpoint before you ever take the camera out of the bag. Exposure, which breaks further into all the different exposure triangle variables and how you use those creatively. The camera, which goes into all the equipment that you use to capture the image, and then the image, which is kind of an amalgamation of all that went before it and actually putting all those pieces together to capture and edit that image that you created. So I feel like it's kind of my core course. I think it's like a prerequisite to some of the other things that I teach. A lot of people may already know a lot of this stuff, but it brings everybody up to the same level before jumping into some of the other courses I'm about to offer on advanced panorama mergers, on HDR mergers, on focus stacking, focus blending, low light photography, and some other stuff that's coming very soon down the pipe. So I hope that you guys will let me know in the comments and questions what you think about the exposure triangle video, what you think about the course, and hit me up with questions. So, and if you haven't been watching Approaching the Scene, this is a series of weekly videos that I do about all things photographic, and I really want you to be a part of that conversation. So hit me up with questions, whether it's about gear, whether it's about the state of the industry, whether it's about capturing better images in the field, editing better images in post-production, you name it, the field's wide open. So you can send those to questions@hudsonhenry.com, or you can log onto the website at www.hudsonhenry.com/ATS and leave your question in there. Of course, just hit up the YouTube channel's comment section. So I've had a raft of questions about both my Google Pixel 3 phone that I just got and my Nikon Z6. I've had a lot of questions about why the Z6 and not the Z7. And I'll just give you the quick rundown. I got the Z6 because I'm filming with the D850 right now. The D850 is my favorite camera that I've ever had. Yeah, it's a big DSLR, but it does just about everything really, really well, from 46 megapixel still files to cropping down on that sensor and photographing it up to 9 frames a second for action with just a ridiculous autofocus tracking system. It's kind of got it all. Focus stacking built in, really high quality video, you name it. The Z6 is something that I wanted to try out to test to see if I even wanted to keep. I've had it for about a week now. I've been having a lot of fun with it. I'm really impressed with its little f4 24-70 kit lens. It is razor sharp, nice and light. It's a nice little system. Kirk Enterprises has sent me a really nice L bracket that fits it, and another little L bracket that fits the FTZ adapter. And my initial impressions are that it's not about to displace my D850 or my D500 for photographing action or anything where I need to track motion, particularly erratic moving objects, like a child on a bike weaving back and forth and flying by sideways at high speed or diagonally towards you, or capturing birds in flight where you need to pick them up fast and track them. That's the kind of thing that the D500, the Nikon D5 in particular, I don't have one of those, but I've used one, and the D850, the D500, and the D5, just there's nothing I've used that are any better at that. And so, I don't see this camera displacing that. However, when it comes to live view focusing, when it comes to tracking moving subjects in video, when it comes to video output quality, it blows away the other Nikon DSLRs. This is by far the finest video handheld camera that I have used. It is just a really, really amazing. Well, I've used a Sony FS700, but that's a little bit different class. It's the finest small, the merger of stills and video camera that I've used yet for video. It works really, really well, and it does an amazing job tracking motion in video. And I can see myself keeping it just for the video. Plus, it does full resolution with no pixel binning or line skipping, 4K video at 10-bit out to my Atomos Ninja 5, so a little monitor that you can record even higher quality video to with more dynamic range. So a really, really high-end camera, and I've found it really satisfying to use. So, I'm not ready to give you a final review. I haven't even fully decided for sure that I'm keeping it, although I think the video chops that it has probably have me keeping it. Plus it has some great time-lapse stuff I'm going to delve more into, and I'll put out a review before long. And my good friend Andy, who I work with a lot from Floating Point Films, is taking a look at it from a video standpoint, and we'll probably do a video review where both of us talk about its relative merits. When it comes to tracking motion, it's not quite there yet. I haven't found too many cameras that are. I know the Sony, I have not used the Sony A9. I've used the A7R III, and I can say definitively I'd rather be shooting with the Nikon D500 and certainly the D5 for fast moving action than the A7R III, although it may be just a little bit better than the Z6. Not a lot, but a little bit at just keeping motion locked in. Definitely better than my Sony a6500, and I may be putting a couple of those cameras up on the chopping block. The Pixel 3 phone is a revolution to me. I actually am starting to have some really interesting thoughts about where we're going with computational photography. And I think that some of the software things that they're doing with this phone are just mind-bending. This is a really cool little tripod holder that Kirk Enterprises sent me to do a little video on. It's just got a great little clamp, and it hooks in via Arca Swiss clamp to any of your existing tripods. You can put it on a tabletop mount with a screw. But This phone deserves to be put in a tripod and used as a camera. Its camera is incredible, and it also works handheld in low light through this incredible night sight mode. And I'll do some stuff where I talk more about that. I will just say that I've used the iPhone 10, and I haven't used the 10s, but I've used the 10, and I've used the Google Pixel 2 and the Google Pixel, and I got to say that this night sight mode, which they made backwards compatible to all their Pixel phones, is just incredible. You hold still for a second, and it gives you this clean, beautiful, well-exposed image in almost no light with no flash. There's very little noise. Everything's razor sharp. It's crazy. It even worked well for me when people in a concert were holding relatively still. I photographed a concert in really low light and got these clean, amazing images. Slight bit of motion blur like the drummer's sticks. But you hit a button and there's just a circle that spins that says hold still, and it takes like 20 images and computes different parts of them and gets rid of all the noise. Sort of the way that video does noise reduction, which is far superior to a single still's ability to do noise reduction. So there's some interesting things coming, and I think that when you start seeing the technology that's coming into our phones right now start coming in to our mirrorless systems of the future, there's going to be some just mind-bending things possible, particularly in low light. It's just getting more and more amazing, and it's an exciting time to be a photographer. I can't wait to see where things are headed. And I do think that the phones are leading the way in some interesting ways. Another question I had, was one person wanted to know if anyone out there wants to buy a large format printer. If anybody knows someone that is interested in a HP, a Hewlett-Packard Z6200. Those are the big, I think they're 44-inch roll feed printers. I have a Z3200, a 24-inch version of that. It might even be a 48-inch printer as I think about it. My printer of choice these days is that Epson 9900 back there. It does a beautiful job, but I still really love my HP Z3200. It has a built-in photospectrometer where you can custom profile different papers and inks by just feeding it in, and it'll print a test sheet and then scan it with a built-in photospectrometer and build a profile for you to soft-proof with, whether you're using Photoshop Lightroom or On1. Pretty cool stuff. So if anybody's interested in a really huge printer, I know someone who's actually selling 2 of those HP, what is it, the 6200s, I think that's the model number. So the big ones, the latest version of the big ones that they made. So great printers. I'm also going to be selling some Sony stuff if anybody's interested in an A6500 or a Voigtlander 10mm f5.6 full frame spherical lens. That's a really special lens, but I'm going to pare down some of the Sony stuff. I think I'm mainly just going to carry that little RX100 Mark V, and because the Nikon mirrorless system is working so well for me, I'm pretty sure I'm going to keep it and just share lenses with my other kit. So those are some interesting little potential, if anybody wants to buy a really nice condition A6500. I'm actually getting rid of a number of things, and I'm going to be putting them up on eBay over the next week or so. I'm also going to be selling my older Nikon D810, which I just haven't gotten around to selling yet. So if you're interested in that, again, hit me up. It's well worn but well cared for. So, all right, there you go. That's about it. One thing I'll say is my next workshop, I have a little break here to enjoy family in the holidays, but the next workshop that I'm going to be running is in Death Valley. My good friend Rick LePage from Complete Digital Photography, and formerly one of the big wigs at On1, and a generally great human being, wonderful photographer, and really, really thoughtful teacher, is going to be with me down in Death Valley. We're taking El Jefe, the big Sprinter van, down there. It's in early March. I'm going to put a link to that workshop down below on the YouTube page. So jump in there. Spots are limited. It's just 10 people. We're going to be staying at Stovepipe Wells. We're going to be exploring some beautiful, beautiful terrain, and there's no place better to be in late January, early February than Death Valley. The temperatures are perfect and the landscapes are gorgeous. So join me. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right. So if you made it all the way to the end of the video, thanks so much. Please click thumbs up. Please click subscribe, and share this series with your friends. I'm having a ton of fun making it, and I'm really glad you're enjoying it. Thanks.